We see a simple tent in the dust, but history saw a technical miracle that shouldn't exist. Imagine former slaves, men who only knew mud and straw, suddenly melting pure gold at 1,000 degrees in the middle of a barren desert. No factories, no coal, and zero room for error. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a modular masterpiece that defies even modern engineering. How did a group of nomads forge a sanctuary out of thin air and extreme heat? Today we decode the impossible engineering of the Tabernacle. When Moses descended Sinai with the blueprints of heaven, he looked at a people whose legacy was written in mud. For 4 centuries, the Hebrews were nothing more than biological machines for the Pharaoh. Their hands were rough from mixing straw and clay. Their backs were curved under the weight of heavy bricks. How could a nation of laborers, who only knew the repetitive, soul-crushing toil of servitude, suddenly become the architects of the divine? Among these thousands of mud workers, God called one man by name, Bezalel. But notice, he didn't just give Bezalel a set of tools. He filled him with a divine spirit of wisdom and understanding. This was the first pivot. A man who spent his life under the whip was now given the authority to design with gold. But Bezalel couldn't do it alone. He needed a team. And so God appointed Oholiab, and together they became the instructors for a nation that had never been taught anything but how to follow orders. This is where the story shifts from construction to transformation. In modern psychology, we recognize a profound truth. A person's identity is often tied to the work of their hands. For the Hebrews, this was redemption through craftsmanship. For the first time in 400 years, they weren't working because they were forced, they were working because they were chosen. Imagine the shift in a man's heart the moment he puts down a wooden brick mold and picks up a jeweler's hammer. Their hands, once stained with the filth of Egypt's pits, were now being washed and prepared to touch the sacred. As they learned to carve wood and shape metal, something profound happened. They weren't just making a box, they were reclaiming their dignity. A slave is merely a tool used by a master, but a craftsman is a creator collaborating with the Almighty. Every hammer blow on that gold was a blow against the memory of their chains. This wasn't just a vocational school in the sand, it was a furnace for the human spirit. Before the tabernacle could stand in the desert, it first had to be built in the minds of a people who had forgotten what it felt like to be free. They were being forged as surely as the metal they worked with. And as we look at the specific technical challenges they faced, like melting gold at impossible temperatures, we begin to see that the most precious thing being refined wasn't the material, it was the men. To build a sanctuary for the Creator, you don't just need gold, you need the kind of heat that transforms it. But we are in the Sinai. There are no forests for fuel, no coal mines, only an endless horizon of sand and a few scattered, twisted trees. Gold becomes liquid only when it reaches a staggering 1,064 degrees Celsius. In an environment where even finding water is a struggle, how did a nation of nomads generate the thermal energy of an industrial furnace? The answer lay in the only abundant resource they had, the acacia tree. To an untrained eye, the acacia is useless, crooked, full of thorns, and difficult to cut. But the Hebrews possessed a secret learned from the master metallurgists of Egypt. When acacia wood is burned slowly in an oxygen-deprived environment, it transforms into high-grade charcoal. This charcoal doesn't just burn, it glows with a slow, constant intensity, reaching temperatures far higher than any ordinary firewood. Imagine the scene: clay ovens molded directly into the sand, fed by leather bellows that were pumped tirelessly by hand to inject a constant stream of air. This was merciless precision work. But here we encounter a massive engineering paradox. In the middle of the desert, with the sun beating down at 40 degrees and a furnace inches away spewing flames at over 1,000 degrees, the human body should reach its breaking point in minutes. How did they survive the dual assault of the sun and the forge? Modern engineers often overlook a detail that the ancient texts highlight. While the artisans worked, a massive pillar of cloud hovered over the camp. We often think of this as a purely religious symbol, but to the men at the furnaces, it was an invisible shield. It functioned as a supernatural climate control system, a physical canopy that lowered the ambient temperature and provided a massive shadow over the entire workspace. It was a pillar of cloud by day, a physical barrier that allowed the air to remain breathable and the workers to stay conscious. Without this invisible shield, the tabernacle would have been a graveyard of craftsmen. But why use acacia at all for the structure? Why not just use solid gold or silver? Here is where the ancient composite technology comes in. God didn't just want something beautiful, he wanted something eternal. Acacia is one of the few woods that is naturally resistant to water, sandstorms, and wood-boring insects. It is essentially incorruptible. In what we would today call advanced material science, the artisans took this rock-hard acacia and covered it entirely in pure gold. This created a perfect composite material. The acacia provided a lightweight, rigid, and durable core, while the gold provided a chemically inert shield that would never rust, tarnish, or corrode in the salty, harsh air of the desert. It was a marriage of the earthly and the divine, a structure built to last for centuries in a place where everything else decays. Yet, even with this technology, there was one object that struck fear into the hearts of the most skilled artisans: the golden menorah. This wasn't just a lampstand, it was the ultimate test of faith and precision. God's command was absolute. It had to be beaten out of a single talent of pure gold. That is approximately 35 kilograms of precious metal. Think about the technical difficulty of that. Most ancient artifacts were made in pieces and then welded or joined together. But the menorah had to be one solid piece. No welds, no seams, no shortcuts. Bezalel and his team had to hammer and mold that 35-kilogram block while it was red hot, shaping the central shaft and the 6 intricate branches simultaneously. One wrong calculation of the temperature, one ill-timed hammer blow, or one tiny crack in the cooling gold, and the entire piece would be ruined. There was no fixing a mistake on a single-piece casting. If they failed, all 35 kilos had to be melted back down to start from zero. The pressure was suffocating. Every strike of the hammer had to be perfect. Through this process, the Hebrews were learning a lesson that surpassed metallurgy. They were learning that the sacred requires absolute fidelity to the pattern. In that impossible fire, they weren't just refining gold, they were being refined themselves. They were discovering that when you follow the divine blueprint, even the most crooked wood and the most ordinary hands can produce a miracle that defies time itself. The tabernacle wasn't a fixed temple. It had no buried stone foundations, no deep concrete footings. It was a masterpiece of mobility, designed to be disassembled in hours whenever the divine cloud moved. But this presents a massive engineering dilemma. How do you keep dozens of gigantic, top-heavy gold-plated boards standing perfectly upright on the unstable, shifting terrain of a desert? If you simply place these heavy planks on the sand, they would sink under their own weight. The wind would topple them. The slightest touch would send the entire sanctuary crashing down. The solution given to Moses was as ingenious as it was unexpected. The answer wasn't in the wood or the gold, it was in the silver. Each acacia plank, standing 4.5 meters tall, had 2 sockets or pins at the bottom. And for every pin, there was a solid silver base. These weren't small decorative pieces. Each individual base weighed 1 talent of silver, approximately 35 kilograms. Imagine the precision required. 96 heavy silver bases meticulously aligned across the uneven desert floor to create a perfectly level foundation. These bases functioned as movable footings. They were heavy to provide absolute stability against the wind, yet precisely molded so that each plank fit into them without any play or wobble. No nails were used, no screws were driven into the earth. The entire structure was held together solely through the calculated combination of gravity, weight, and a precise friction fit. But vertical stability wasn't enough. To prevent the walls from bowing or collapsing laterally, God ordained a series of crossbars, long acacia beams covered in gold that slid through rings attached to the planks. These bars locked the individual boards together, transforming the entire perimeter into a single, rigid, modular body. In essence, what the Hebrews were building was a prefabricated modular system, centuries before the concept of modern engineering even existed. This was a structure that could be lifted, loaded, and reset hundreds of times over 40 years of wandering. It never went out of alignment. It never lost its structural integrity. Every joint remained as tight on the 40th year as it was on the first day, because every measurement was executed with absolute fidelity to the divine blueprint. It was a miracle of precision, built on the shifting sands of Sinai. While the artisans were finishing the golden walls, another critical part of the tabernacle was taking shape. These were the garments of the high priest. But make no mistake, these were not just religious robes or symbolic vestments. In the presence of the absolute holiness of God, these garments functioned as spiritual survival equipment. Exodus 28 describes each piece in staggering detail. Every thread, every color, and every stone had a specific measurement. Why such obsession with detail? Because entering the most holy place, the inner sanctum where the Ark of the Covenant rested, was not a common ritual. It was an act of absolute lethal risk. One mistake in the measurements, one omitted detail, or one oversight in the cleansing process, and the priest could die instantly. Imagine the weight of responsibility as the priest dressed. He wore the breastplate of judgment, a square of folded fabric containing 12 precious stones. These weren't just decorative, they were polished and engraved with surgical precision, each bearing the name of a tribe of Israel. In the ancient world, engraving a gemstone required abrasive powders, primitive hand drills, and a level of patience that is hard to imagine today, all performed in the middle of a dusty desert. These stones were fastened by chains of pure gold. The physical weight was real, but the symbolic weight was even greater. When the priest entered the presence, he carried the entire nation on his chest. But this brings us to one of the most unsettling parts of the garment, the blue robe. At the hem of this robe, there were fabric pomegranates interspersed with bells of pure gold. Exodus 28:35 declares a chilling instruction. The sound of the bells will be heard when he enters the sanctuary, so that he does not die. These bells were literally a life monitor. As long as the bells were ringing, the people waiting outside knew the priest was still moving. He was still alive. The presence of God had not consumed him. In that desert silence, the most terrifying sound in the world would be the sudden cessation of those golden bells. Now we must address one of the most persistent legends in history, the rope tied around the high priest's ankle. Most of us have heard the story that because no one else could enter the most holy place, a rope was used so that if the priest died inside, his body could be pulled out without anyone else risking their lives. But here is the twist. If you search every verse of the Torah, from Exodus to Leviticus, you will not find a single mention of a rope. This detail actually appears centuries later in Jewish mystical texts like the Zohar. So why does this myth endure? Because it captures a very real human emotion, the terror of the absolute. Instead of a physical rope, the priest's only safety net was the sound of those bells and the absolute fidelity of his preparation. He walked into the heart of the tabernacle without a physical exit strategy. He relied entirely on the purity of his heart and the exactness of the pattern God had shown Moses. The legend of the rope is a human invention, but the fear it represents was very real. It shows that in the ancient world, the tabernacle was not just a beautiful tent. It was a boundary between life and death. The gold plate on the priest's forehead was inscribed with "Holiness to the Lord," a final warning that he was not entering in his own name, but as a bridge between a sinful people and a perfect God. As the priest stepped past the heavy veil, he left behind the world of mud and straw, entering a realm where even a single misplaced thread could be fatal. In the silence of the Sinai, the tabernacle stood as a testament that the closer you get to the Creator, the more precision matters. After nearly a year of hammers striking gold and looms spinning linen, the desert fell silent. It was the first day of the first month, and the construction was finally over. Moses walked through the sanctuary one last time, checking every peg, every silver socket, and every golden ring. Every detail matched the pattern shown on the mountain with absolute surgical precision. The work of human hands was complete. But as the people gathered around the perimeter, the atmosphere changed. The wind seemed to stop. The heat of the Sinai sun was suddenly eclipsed by a different kind of intensity. A cloud, dense, heavy, and luminous, began to descend from the heights of the mountain. It didn't just hover, it settled. It grew thick and heavy, filling the interior of the tabernacle with a light so brilliant and a presence so weighty that time itself seemed to stop. This was the moment of validation. The Kutu Nole of Egypt stood in awe as they realized their work had been accepted. The simple tent of skins and acacia wood had been transformed into the residence of the Creator. But then a strange and unsettling thing happened. Moses, the same man who had walked through the Red Sea and spoken with God face to face as a friend, tried to enter the tent, and he couldn't. Exodus 40 tells us that Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Why? Why would the man who oversaw the entire project be barred from the finish line? Because at that moment, the tabernacle was no longer a human construction. It had become a portal. The glory was so thick, so physically overwhelming, that no mortal frame, not even Moses, could withstand the unfiltered weight of that holiness. For the first time in history, the Creator had a permanent, mobile address among His people. From that day on, the tabernacle became the beating heart of the nation. When the cloud lifted, they marched. When it rested, they camped. The impossible engineering had served its purpose. It created a space where the eternal could dwell within the temporary. The slaves who once made bricks for a dead pharaoh were now the guardians of a living glory. Every sacrifice, every light in the menorah, and every step in the sand was now guided by the presence that dwelt just behind the veil. The desert was still harsh, and the journey was still long, but they were no longer just survivors. They were a people inhabited by the divine. For 4 decades, this extraordinary structure was a nomad, just like the people it protected. But a remarkable detail emerges. This tent was never the final plan. It was temporary, adapted for pilgrims, and built specifically for the journey. When Israel finally entered the Promised Land, the gold and fabrics eventually gave way to the permanent stone and cedar of Solomon's temple. But if you look at the timeline of history, a haunting question remains. What happened to all that gold? Where did the silver bases and the intricately woven cherubim go? History tells us that the stones were eventually toppled, the metals were looted by empires, and the physical ark vanished into the shadows of time. Why would the Creator allow such a perfect, divinely inspired design to simply disappear? The answer is found in the realization that the tabernacle was never the end. It was the beginning. It was a prototype for something far more durable than gold or stone. Think back to the acacia wood, the crooked, thorny, and seemingly useless tree of the Sinai. To any passerby, that wood had no value. But once it was planed, smoothed, and covered in pure gold, it became the very skeleton of God's house. This is the final blueprint, and it isn't about a building. It is about you. We often ask why we must endure the impossible fires and the merciless heat of our own deserts. We feel like that acacia wood, scarred, crooked, and overlooked by the world. But the tabernacle reveals a profound trilogy. The divine does not look for perfect materials. He looks for a heart that is willing to be refined. Each hammer blow of discipline in your life, each moment where you choose obedience over shortcuts, is a layer of gold being applied to your character. You are the final construction. The tabernacle was designed to be mobile because God wanted to show that He doesn't dwell in a fixed location or a house made with human hands. He dwells in a people who are on the move. The glory that once filled that tent in the desert was a shadow of the glory that now seeks to inhabit you. You are the mobile sanctuary. The tabernacle didn't disappear, it simply changed its address. It moved from a tent of skins to a temple of stone, and finally into the very breath and soul of those who walk by faith. The question is no longer, where is the tabernacle, but are you ready to be inhabited by the light? The true glory was never held by walls of gold. It was forged in the hearts of pilgrims on a journey. But what happens when the mobile tent becomes a permanent palace? In our next episode, the story of the tabernacle reaches its most mysterious chapter, the tragic collapse of Solomon's kingdom and the vanishing of the Ark of the Covenant. Subscribe to uncover where the gold went and why the presence left. The revelation continues next time.